One of the most frustrating things about sex after menopause is not that it changes, it's that no one explains why. People are told what to try, what to buy, what to avoid, and what to accept. But rarely are they walked through how the system actually works when it's healthy. And without that foundation, even good advice sounds random, ineffective, or contradictory. So before we talk about solutions, especially non-hormonal ones, we need to talk about normal function, because you can't appreciate what's failing if you were never shown what success looked like in the first place. Before menopause, vaginal health is not maintained by sex or estrogen alone. It's maintained by a quiet cooperation between hormones, blood flow, nerves, connective tissue, and time. Remove one piece, and the system doesn't collapse instantly, but it does become less forgiving. Estrogen's role is often described vaguely, as if it's just about lubrication, which is like saying oil is just about shine in an engine. Estrogen maintains the thickness of the vaginal lining, supports blood vessels that bring oxygen and nutrients to the tissue, preserves elasticity so the tissue can stretch without tearing, and keeps the environment acidic enough to protect against infection. It also supports how quickly the tissue recovers after sex, which matters far more than people realize. When estrogen declines, none of these systems fail overnight. What happens instead is that the margin for error disappears. Things that used to be harmless, slightly rushed sex, mild dehydration, skipped recovery time, start to matter. And this is where misunderstanding begins. Many women still have desire after menopause. Some even experience a psychological or emotional liberation that increases interest in sex. But desire is a brain process, and vaginal readiness is a vascular and tissue process. They are connected, but they are not the same thing. When estrogen is low, desire can still turn on the lights, but it doesn't always power the plumbing. To understand why non-hormonal strategies struggle, you need to understand what the vagina actually does when it prepares for sex. Vaginal arousal is not simply getting wet, it's a blood flow event. During arousal, blood vessels in the vaginal walls dilate. Fluid moves out of those vessels into the tissue and onto the surface. The tissue thickens, lengthens, and becomes more elastic. The vaginal canal subtly changes shape. This process takes time, and it depends on adequate blood volume, intact vessels, and responsive tissue. Hydration plays a surprisingly large role here. Blood volume is directly affected by hydration status. When the body is mildly dehydrated, which is extremely common in midlife and later adulthood, circulating blood volume decreases. The body prioritizes blood flow to the brain and heart. Genital tissue is not high on the emergency list. Less blood flow means slower arousal, less lubrication, and reduced tissue expansion. This isn't dramatic dehydration. Even habitual underdrinking can matter. This is one reason why "just use lube" often feels insufficient. Lubrication is the surface result of arousal, not the process itself. Adding lubrication externally helps reduce friction, but it doesn't restore blood flow or tissue thickness underneath. It's like greasing a hinge without fixing the warped door. Diet plays a quieter role, but it's not irrelevant. Certain substances act as dehydrating agents or vascular constrictors. Excess caffeine, alcohol, very high sodium intake, and chronically low carbohydrate intake can all reduce effective blood volume or impair circulation. None of these are catastrophic on their own, but when estrogen support is already gone, small stressors accumulate. Vaginal tissue becomes less tolerant not because one thing went wrong, but because several small supports quietly disappeared. Sex itself, when it happens under the right conditions, is normally protective. Gentle, adequately aroused sexual activity increases blood flow, supports elasticity, and reinforces nerve signaling between the brain and pelvic tissue. But this only works when the tissue can tolerate the activity. When arousal is rushed or incomplete, or when recovery time is insufficient, sex becomes micro-injurious rather than conditioning. Tiny tears may not be visible, but the tissue remembers them. Healing is slower after menopause, and inflammation lingers longer. This is where many people misunderstand the phrase, use it or lose it. Use alone does not preserve vaginal health. Use without injury does. And injury becomes easier when estrogen is low.
This is also why women who had a long, comfortable sex life before menopause often experience a slower transition. Their tissue enters menopause in better condition, with preserved elasticity and blood flow patterns. That doesn't stop estrogen loss from having an effect, but it delays the moment when problems become obvious. In contrast, women who had limited or painful sex earlier in life and then experience a surge in desire later are often shocked by how quickly pain appears. Their desire arrives after the tissue has already lost resilience. None of this is about effort, morality, or doing it right. It's about timing and tissue biology. So what does a realistic, non-hormonal strategy look like once you understand the normal system? It looks less like a single fix and more like environmental support. Supporting hydration so blood volume is adequate, reducing chronic dehydrating inputs, allowing more time for arousal so blood flow can actually build, using vaginal moisturizers regularly, not as sexual aids, but as tissue maintenance, because hydrated tissue is less fragile, choosing lubricants that don't disrupt pH or pull water out of cells, spacing penetrative sex to allow recovery, and, critically, avoiding the idea that pushing through pain will somehow train the tissue. Pain trains inflammation, not resilience. None of these restore estrogen. None of them recreate premenopausal tissue. But together, they reduce friction between biology and expectation. They keep the system functioning within its new limits instead of constantly testing where it breaks. And that's the key misunderstanding many people have. Non-HRT strategies are not meant to replace hormones. They are meant to protect what remains, slow decline, and preserve comfort where possible. When people expect more than that, they feel misled. When they expect nothing, they give up too early. The real failure isn't menopause. It's that people are asked to manage it without ever being taught how their bodies worked when things were going well. Once you understand that, the conversation becomes calmer, more realistic, and, ironically, more hopeful. Because even without perfect solutions, informed adaptation is still better than confusion and self-blame. If you're a partner listening to this, especially one whose desire hasn't declined or hasn't declined at the same pace, this part is for you. One of the most damaging misunderstandings around sex after menopause is the idea that discomfort or avoidance means loss of attraction, loss of love, or loss of interest. In reality, what's usually happening is much simpler and much less personal. The tissue has changed faster than expectations have. From the outside, it can be confusing. Your partner may still flirt, still initiate, still enjoy closeness, still want intimacy. And then, when things turn physical, hesitation appears, or pain, or a sudden stop that feels abrupt and unexplained. It's easy, in that moment, to feel rejected or shut out. What's important to understand is that postmenopausal pain is often delayed. The discomfort may not peak during sex, but hours later or the next day, when inflammation sets in and micro-injuries make themselves known. So, when a partner pulls back the next time, they may be reacting not to you, but to their own memory of what followed last time. This is why pushing through pain is not helpful. It doesn't build tolerance. It builds inflammation and fear. And fear is one of the strongest inhibitors of arousal there is. Once the body starts bracing for injury, no amount of reassurance from the mind can fully override that reflex. Partners often underestimate how much pace and preparation matter now. Vaginal arousal takes longer after menopause, not because desire is weaker, but because blood flow builds more slowly and tissue expands less easily. Rushing what used to be spontaneous doesn't make things exciting, it makes them fragile. What once felt like passion can now feel like pressure, even when none is intended. This is also where frequency needs to be rethought. More is not always better. Recovery time matters. Tissue that hasn't healed yet doesn't become stronger with more friction, it becomes more irritated. Spacing penetrative sex, alternating with non-penetrative intimacy, and allowing rest days is not a concession to aging, it's basic tissue biology. Perhaps the most important thing partners can do is separate their sense of being desired from the mechanics of penetration. Desire is not measured by how quickly someone says yes, how often penetration happens, or how much discomfort they tolerate. Desire shows up in curiosity, closeness, playfulness, and willingness to adapt together. Sex after menopause often works best when it becomes more collaborative and less scripted. Less about recreating what used to happen automatically, and more about discovering what still feels good now. That shift isn't a downgrade, it's a redesign.
And finally, this needs to be said clearly. If your partner is navigating these changes without hormones, they are already working with fewer biological supports than they used to have. Patience, flexibility, and genuine curiosity are not acts of charity. They are part of what keeps intimacy alive when the body's margin for error has narrowed. Menopause does not end sexuality, but it does demand mutual adjustment. When partners understand the biology instead of personalizing the symptoms, sex stops being a test of endurance or reassurance and becomes, once again, a shared experience.